All right, so can everybody see?
Yes.
Perfect. So hi everyone, good evening or good morning from wherever you're joining, and thanks again for joining this special event that that is done by collaboration with ProductTank, the to Dubai chapter, and Product People. So we're going to start now with our guest speaker, Albert Diaz, who's a product at Google, and he's going to be talking to us this evening about leading without authority. Now, before we hand it over to him, I'm going to introduce my co-host for this evening, Mihai. Mihai, would you care to say a couple of things about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mihai. I'm based out of Dubai. I'm very passionate about product management. I'm running the community of ProductTank for the city of Dubai. And yeah, I'm quite excited to talk with Albert. Albert, it's at our second appearance, so to say, and I'm pretty sure he has a lot of super insightful things to share with us. Yeah, so I look forward for the talk.
Thank you, Mihai and Mansoor. Allow me a moment to share my screen.
Yeah, no, just a moment before, so I'm going to talk about myself. So I'm Mansoor Tamre, no worries. So I'm the Community Growth Manager of Product People. I've been overlooking our events and our activities ever since June 2021, and I'm happy to see our community growing and getting even more interesting speakers such as Albert tonight. For those who are newcomers or first-timers at this event, so to know more about Product People, we are a company that helps other companies discover and deliver great products faster. We empower our product community by sharing knowledge generously. This is the goal of such events and such exchanges that we do. However, our professional side is that we do all the hands-on and unglamorous work of product managers on an interim basis. This usually goes from 3 to 36 months. We onboard fast, aligned teams and deliver outcomes. So, and here's a quick preview of some of our clients. People based in Europe and mainly in Germany might be familiar with some of them. I'm going to just name Zalando, Tier, and maybe Freeletics that are pretty common. And now, without further ado, back to you, Albert. So Albert is a product at Google. He's going to be presenting a very interesting topic for us tonight. So leading without authority, something that I think most of us struggle with sometimes, and it would be very useful to understand how it can be done the right way, of course. So handing it over to you, Albert and Mihai.
Thanks, Mansoor. From a false start to a proper start now. So let me share my screen. Give me just 1 second. And okay, I hope you can see my screen. So thank you, Mansoor, Mihai again. Of course, I'm a product manager at Google. My name is Albert, and I'll be speaking today about leading without authority. Here's a little bit about myself. So I'd like to believe that I began my career in 2001, and I was an engineering undergrad back then, and I enjoyed building web apps. Back then, the coolest thing on the internet was a little piece of technology that you may sort of hate today, known as Flash. But that was the coolest thing back then. So I started my career over there, and that continued for a while until I had the opportunity to with some dear friends, co-found a travel e-commerce startup. It was the first travel e-commerce startup in the Middle East. Now, e-commerce is much today, but if you rewind the clock to 2008, that was akin to what you might have today in perhaps self-driving cars, electric cars, and machine learning and more. So it was one of the hottest things on the scene back then. I started my career in that startup working in technology, and I very quickly realized that in that role, I had the ability to do a number of things together. I brought people together to understand user experience, understand communications, marketing, go-to-market, understanding how to test products, understanding how research contributed to the development of new products and the roadmap, and of course, the customer lifecycle in these areas. And we didn't quite have a very good name for that back then. One of my favorite books today to look back on, of course, is Marty Kagan's Inspired, but you know, despite the book having been published in 2008, it didn't quite gain the traction that it has today back then. And so I didn't have the title of product anything at that point in time. And this continued for a while until I realized a few years down the line that I really enjoyed working on products. And I, at that point in time, had the opportunity to work on a new venture within the business where we created a new unit. And I shifted gears formally from working in technology to working on product. Now, if you know a co-founder, if you know people who work in startups out there, there's a very unique phenomenon that happens there. And that is that if you're working on something that is cool today, people by default will see you as having a halo around your head. And almost every word that comes out of your mouth is sort of magic. And it's wonderful what that does for authority, because you could be in a room with 12 people from different functions and you'd still have the authority to drive what you needed to drive in that meeting. By virtue, of course, of being a co-founder, authority often came baked in because you were building teams around you and you were hiring people and you were structuring them. And so authority came out of the box with a lot of that. Then in 2020, which is about a little over a year ago, I had a unique opportunity to join the team in Zurich here at Google. And of course, with that, I had to forego all that authority and come into a very different role, a role that gave me far bigger opportunities, far bigger reach in terms of the sheer scale of the products that the team works with over here. But in a lot of ways, it felt like starting over. And I had to learn some skills that I hadn't quite developed in the past, and had to lean in on techniques and tools that I developed from my years in the startup. And it's one of those tools that I want to talk about today, one of those learnings that I want to talk about today, and that is leading without authority. What happens when you trade those fancy titles, trade that sort of big desk, that big room, for a team where everyone works collaboratively, for a team where everyone works by consensus, which for most people in product today is pretty much how your roles are structured. How do you do it? Well, let's take a step back. What is authority? If you think of it, authority is the foundation of modern society. It's almost primal. A gentleman named Christopher Ansel probably had one of the best ways to define this. He had a book called The Pragmatist Democracy. And he spoke about different types of authority, but he said that authority was essentially the ability to get someone to do what you wanted them to do. Not very complicated, right, in principle. But authority has different shapes and different forms, and each one of them has requires a different structure and requires a different skill for yourselves. So if you think about these three primitive types of authority that Christopher Ansel spoke about, they each have a different way of working. Those three different types of authority are indexical authority, iconic authority, and symbolic authority. Indexical authority is essentially saying, I made this. And my favorite visual for this is Tom Hanks in Castaway. If you can imagine Tom Hanks standing at that beach, lighting that bonfire and saying to Wilson, look what I've made. I've made fire. That's indexical authority. It's someone claiming that I have this authority by virtue of what I have made. And in a lot of ways, this is what comes with being in a startup. If you're the co-founder or a person in the early founding years of one of these organizations, you tend to have indexical authority. Then you have iconic authority. And iconic authority is, essentially saying, I am this. I am a king. I am a ruler. And these are very different types of authority. They often don't have the sort of the I started this, I made this, that you come with indexical authority, but they still hold significant rank and title to be able to do what they want to do. Indexical authority, of course, is very known for potentially leading some ways to bad authority, and we'll talk about that later on in the session, but that's indexical authority for you. And last but not least, you have symbolic authority. This is what you tend to have typically amongst law enforcement officials, police, members of the army, and they talk about, I represent this, I represent righteousness, or I represent the government, and they tend to achieve what they need to achieve using that vested authority. Of course, with each of these types of authority, there is a penalty. So if you don't listen to someone in a high-ranking position in the startup, you don't listen to the ruler of the country, you don't listen to policemen around the corner, there are penalties to be paid. And so authority needs some amount of enforcement. But I don't want to go down that particular route as much. Suffice it to say that we're in society today because we have systems of authority around us, and they help us lead a peaceful life, a safe life. Now, is this really how most people see this today, though? I mean, if you rewind the clock to perhaps 100, 1,000 years ago, people thrived on authority. People wanted, they asked, they demanded authority in a lot of ways for this governance. But as our society gets increasingly more decentralized, and as people become more independent and more mindful, the generations that we speak of today, the millennials, a lot of them are beginning to see some of this authority, not all of it, but some of it, as an illusion. The reality is that nobody has ever had enough authority, and you probably never have and never will. You tend to see this in examples of what happens when you have a riot or you have social unrest. It's essentially a breakdown of authority. Alan Cohen and David Bradford were two distinguished professors who actually coined this particular phrase that you see on screen, and they recognized this early on. In fact, if you rewind the clock to how workplaces, at least some workplaces, used to operate in the late 80s and maybe the late 70s as well, companies thrived on teaching leaders on how to command, how to build that sense of rallying people around you by building a very firm hand, a very firm sense of direction, and passing that message down. There are urban legends of how people in some countries even had a sort of courses on how to yell and how to be I think it was called a devil boss at one point in time. But that's not, I cannot imagine that working in most workplaces today, and I imagine you cannot either. And so in today's workplaces, we've moved on from thinking that the solution was to command, that to a position today where we know that people want purpose and people want meaning. And that purpose and meaning is what's changing how we lead with authority today. It isn't about commanding, it isn't about direction. It's about finding that consensus, it's finding that insight that lets people believe in your leadership without necessarily being given that direction. In fact, there was a gentleman named Keith Ferrazzi who once said, how dare today's generation demand purpose? How dare they demand this sense of I will guide myself when people before us gave this up? But that is the world we live in. And that's makes for some very interesting conversations. Are we really better without? Are we better without authority? I spent many years of my career telling the people around me that I didn't want what I called toothless managers, that I didn't want people who didn't have a direct chain of command, that they had people to drive, steer, and grow, and of course, at the end, the other way around, report into. But the reality is that's changed. And product folk today in most organizations simply do not have the authority to determine outcomes. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's not true. I could sort of make this work if I wanted to. But if you think to yourself and you realize who that person in engineering is actually accountable to, who that designer is actually accountable to, who that analyst is actually accountable to, in most organizations, it rarely is, if ever, the product manager. They'll each report into their lines of report. And if they didn't have faith or belief in what the product manager wanted them to do or was rallying them to do, you'd find very quickly that you didn't have much authority. And so it's a calling. It's a special skill to be able to lead people without authority. Some people are better with it. Some people are better without. If you're on this call, if you're listening to it, and if you're in the field of product, I'd like to believe that this is something that you found a calling in. And it certainly is an important skill that you'll want to cultivate and develop. It certainly isn't everyone's cup of tea. The key here is to forget about the illusion of authority and instead focus on two things. That's a core of what I'm going to be speaking about today. Focus on leading, but more importantly, focus on influencing. The world has shifted from just seeking authority to influencing. And influencing is probably the most powerful skill that you can develop today as a growing product manager in your role at whichever level you may be. Whether it's influencing your CEO, influencing the peers around you, it's an important skill. Now, one of the problems with product management is that we often have the word manager or management baked into the title. So we think that our roles are here to manage. And with management, we tend to think about things like, what is our mission? And what can I approve? What are my tasks? What can I forecast? The reality is that as you grow in your career as a product manager, you'll want to think about how can I envision this? How can I motivate this? How can I trust the people around me to do this? And how can I encourage them to take risks? How can I set these goals, but let them set goals for themselves as well? Every product manager out there, as they grow in their career, should seek to shift from managing through to leading. If you're an APM in the early years of your career, it's fine to manage, but if you're growing further along, you'll want to build the skills of leadership that you see here. And why is that? Products need leaders. Products need leaders to shout out the vision from the rooftop, to know the mission of their companies and make it available to everyone out there, to be the customer's voice, and of course, last but not least, to create a culture of inclusion, to create a curiosity for ideas. You'll hear this phrase in a lot of books, people talking about how you want to build teams of missionaries around you as opposed to mercenaries, and this relates to all of that. So how do you do this? It's nice to say that I want to be able to lead people, I want to be able to influence them. How do I do this? Well, you need to learn to build influence. And so influence, unlike what I said earlier about leadership, and authority, is about the art of getting someone to believe in what you believe. And it's very different from authority. It's certainly not the same as convincing. If you're in a conversation where you feel that you need to convince someone, it's too late. You've already missed the train. You often will want to build influence much, much earlier than that. If you're in a conversation where you find that you're struggling to get your message across, you're in a tough spot and you'll want to find a way to rebuild that relationship. Go back and try and build influence instead. The key is to drive consensus towards a common goal. And that common goal may not necessarily be what you want. It may not be necessarily what your colleague wants, or the person you're speaking to wants, but what you perhaps may together want in the interest of the organization, in the interest of the product you're building. The key is to collaborate in inception, to seed that idea not only in your companion's mind, but also in the organization's minds, to make that something believable, and people will follow from there on their own. They will be missionaries unto themselves. Now, there are two gentlemen who wrote a very interesting book. Alan Cohen and David Bradford wrote a book called Influencing Without Authority. And they have a model which is known as the Cohen-Bradford model. And I'm going to talk very briefly today about this because this is something you'll want to take away from here and remember. And so the Cohen-Bradford model talks about 6 steps. The first step is to ally. Ally with everyone. Don't wait to be in that meeting. Don't wait to be in that room where you have a position where you have to defend yourself, where you have to try and convince someone. Ally with people from day one. I remember coming into this organization and setting up, I think, of the order of about 50 calls over video chat within the first about 2.5 weeks of my time there. And those were probably the most wonderful conversations I had. I got to learn about these people, what they were doing, but also know them on an individual level, one by one. A lot of them are dear friends to this very day. Of course, not all those conversations continued. Some of them proved to be perhaps not as relevant to my role, but ally with everyone from day one is a really important part of this model. It is the foundation of what you want to do first. Second, clarify your goals. There's a wonderful practice within the teams that I see at Google, and one of those practices is for people to sort of write a one-pager about themselves. It's a little doc in which they talk about, this is me, this is who I am, this is how I work, this is what I like, this is what I dislike, these are my objectives, this is what I want to achieve in 5 years, this is what I want to achieve with my products. And it's incredibly insightful because you skipped a half an hour to an hour, maybe sometimes even a week of conversation with someone to really get to know them a little better. And in doing that for yourself, you'll have to clarify what your goals are to people who may want to talk to you as well. Clarifying these goals is really important because if you find yourself in a conversation with someone or trying to ally with someone who has completely incompatible goals, that's a formula for failure in a lot of ways. If you have no choice, you'll often need to find ways to just whittle that lack of common ground down to something, a shred of commonality, which is a starting point. But it always helps to find a way to clarify your goals from the very beginning if you want to build success here. Once you've allied with someone and you've clarified your goals, it's really important to be able to empathize with them. We talk about empathy a lot in product management because we're often called to empathize with the users of our products. We often fail to empathize, though, with the people on our teams. And that's really important. If you want to be able to build influence with someone, you'll want to empathize with them. You'll want to understand what they're going through, why those goals that they set up in the previous step are important to them, what their personal aspirations may be, why they're going where they're headed, why they're doing things the way they are they having a rough day, and could you potentially help them? I know this sounds somewhat calculating, but it's a genuine skill. No one's asking you to go out there and sort of have an agenda, have a strategy, go to a meeting and say, okay, I'm going to ask this person how they're feeling, how their day was, and so on. It's really about building an authentic and a relatable friendship with people in that room to be able to empathize with that person and understand why they've allied with you and what their goals are and how they're trying to get there. Once you've done this, you want to be able to identify currencies. Now, I'm not suggesting that you change your money over here. The term currencies here refers, of course, to things of value. So if you realize that you are working with someone who is really keen to, for example, grow in their career, or is looking to build a bridge with someone on your team, that currency could be something as simple as you helping that person with tips and learnings about how you grew in your career. It could be as simple as an introduction to that person on your team. It's a small currency, but it starts here. It's an IOU of sorts, if you will. By building these currencies over time, you start to build something more than just empathy and an understanding of these individuals, but you start to build a sense of ownership and a sense where you each have a responsibility towards each other. And this is not just about finding things that the other person may need help with, but also things that you may need help with too. And it is in this relationship that you'll find that you both will now start holding currencies that are of value to each other and start sharing benefits with that point from there. Of course, it's great to have all of this, but if you've gotten this far with someone in a position at work where you're looking to really build a sense of influence, you need to now be able to relate to them and make time. In a lot of ways, this sounds like relationships, and that's because it is. Building influence is not about a cut and dry, shake of the hand, put up a doc, this is what I want. It's about building genuine relationships with people you work with and finding ways to succeed. So make time to relate. Relating starts from the simplest of things. You know, when you think about how you might relate to individuals today, it's about seeing eye to eye on things that are of interest. It's about empathizing with the person across the table. There was an interesting study from the University of Michigan where they studied the levels of empathy between college students today and college students, I believe it was about 30 years ago. And they found that empathy has been declining year over year over year. And that's because when you rewind the clock and think of how people worked, a lot of people had a natural sense of empathy back then, but we've come to society today where we've become very meaning about what we want to do and very cut and dry about how we want to achieve things. It's time to rewind that clock and go back to relating to people and building great relationships with the teams you want to work with. Last but not least, if you've come this far, you should have some sense of influence by this point in time. You should not be in a meeting room with the person you've just done all these steps with and have to find a way to convince that person, because you should have some sense of influence in that room today. And you should be able to reciprocate. Influence is not just about getting what you want done. As much as you've worked this hard to say, I've gotten this far, where's my, my pot of gold at the rainbow? Influence is about doing things in a reciprocal manner. You will want to support other people when they need influence, and you will want to lean in on them when you need influence from them. And so if you follow these 6 steps from the Cohen-Bradford model, which is ally, clarify, empathize, find currencies, relate, and reciprocate, you will find a more meaningful sense of authority, and authority built on influence for the people you work with. And hopefully that'll work better for you too. My last slide here today, and I won't keep you too long because I'm sure that you've got a couple of questions, and if you'd be interested to hear them. There are, of course, barriers to influence. As I said earlier, if you're not able to see eye to eye with someone, if you don't share common goals, or worse yet, if you have radically, orthogonal goals, that can be a big barrier to influence. You should learn to recognize these and learn when you may be up against a brick wall. The very first barrier to influence often is a power gap. If you find a conversation, for example, between an APM and the CEO of the company, that's going to be hard to bridge. You'll often find that that power gap stands in the way. There's very little that APM can often do to build influence with the CEO. The CEO has a lot of authority in that position, and so it can be very hard to build this influence. So a large power gap can be a problem there. The other one, of course, as I remarked earlier, is incompatible goals. If you have objectives that are orthogonal to each other, completely just non-supportive, that's a deal breaker a lot of time. And if you find yourself in this position, you want to know you want to cut your losses early or work harder, perhaps with someone around you to find what might be of common ground between the two of yourselves. Rivalry, where you have a sense of perhaps apathy for each other, is another deal breaker for influence. If you're trying to work with someone who is a hard rival, that can be a big problem for influence because you're rarely going to empathize with each other. You'll always have an inauthentic relationship with that individual. And so rivalry can be difficult. There are ways to surmount this, but one of the easiest ones you want to do is find a way, again, to break that rivalry and find common interest for the interest of the company, for the benefit of the company, and of course, the product. The last ones, of course, apathy towards someone else's goals. If you are not interested in what the other person, and genuinely interested in what the other person is trying to achieve, it isn't going to go very far. You need to find authenticity and reciprocity to build influence. It's not just about taking a formula, steps 1 through 6, and saying, we're going to build influence tomorrow morning. An authentic relationship and a reciprocal relationship is what leads generally to positive influence. And of course, poor attitude. Nothing breaks influence quite like poor attitude. If you're in a room where you're perhaps disrespectful, if you're you're at the office and someone who often tries to get your way around by shouting out, trying to sort of break rank and do these sorts of things. I don't need to list them all. I'm sure you've seen this of some individuals in your careers. That can often be a deal breaker, a barrier to influence. And of course, the last one, the fear of reaction or failure can be a tough one as well. Take a leap of faith. If you're not going to get into a position where you want to work with someone, understand their goals, share your objectives, and learn from them, the fear of failure can often be one of the hardest things to get over. Take that leap of faith, make a step, reach out, and try and see how you might work with someone else in a more open manner. You might surprise yourself and the other individual and find a work together than you might have expected in the past. And of course, that's pretty much it from me. I hope you've learned a few things from today's session. My name is Albert. I'm a product manager at Google, and that was Leading Without Authority.
All right, thanks a lot, Albert. That was indeed pretty insightful and pretty interesting. Everyone, I'm just going to say that we're open for questions. Feel free to start thinking about your questions or formulating them, typing them into the comments or chat. Meanwhile, to give you some more time to do that, I'm going to share my screen again and talk for a couple of minutes just to give you this this extra time. So let's do that again. All right. So a little bit back about product people. So some use cases about when or how we can be most effective are if your company got recent funding and needs to grow their product team quite quickly to keep up with all the expansion. If you've got PMs on parental leaves that I believe are getting longer, especially in Europe. Or if you've got some PMs that left or are leaving the company and the hiring would take time and you don't want to keep a gap in between. Or if you have a temporary initiative that is important and urgent, or if you just would like to take an outsider's view to appraise the product team. So these are some of the examples. Here I'm sharing some of the positive feedback we get from our clients. Again, to say that we really like to deliver. This is what we take pride in. And this is a quick glimpse of our team. As you can see, we come from very diverse and diverse backgrounds. However, the legal entity is located in Berlin. And finally, we're hiring. So for the people who are looking into getting into product management, or for experienced product managers as well, we're hiring. We're also looking for a talent acquisition manager, since our team is expanding, and we are also on the lookout for a team and an executive assistant. And for more on these, you can check them on productpeople.join.com. Now, with that, I'm going to go to the Q&A. So let's see if we have any questions then, or maybe Mihai, you'd like to begin?
Yeah, I wanted to ask something. You've mentioned about the one pager that you have been that is being used in Google. So is this something that you write beforehand, and when you join the company, you just share it with whoever wants to get to know you better?
Pretty much. I mean, imagine it being your LinkedIn page. So if you're on a public platform like LinkedIn, and if you could write on LinkedIn as honestly as possible, how you want to work and what you're looking to achieve, that's essentially what that is. Google, of course, has an internal platform where people put this material up, but I'm sure that if you have a similar platform within your organizations, you could choose to share it there as well. A profile page is probably the easiest place to start.
Yeah, that's easier. It's a good place to start. However, the past organizations that work with their internal platforms were not as used as probably in Google. So that's why probably the visibility would have been lower. But that's anyway, it's an interesting case, because from my past experience, whenever I join a company, you spend, as you said, the first week repeating the same story. Where are you from? What are your hobbies? How you got into product? And that's probably quite a good tip to jump over that. Okay, I do have a question until people start asking their own questions. It's not necessarily a question, but I'm more interested on the sphere of influence and convincing. I think these two terms are overlapping a little bit. So as much as me as the product manager, I want to influence the team to go into a certain direction, I think that also has a little bit of convincing. It's either because of the ego or either because of, you really want that feature. But I think in that moment, you slip a little bit towards convincing someone to build something that you want. So my question is, how would you keep yourself, how do you keep yourself as objective as possible to yourself and not to, push your own agenda forward? If you have any insights on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a hard one. I'll be honest that I've found myself on a couple of occasions in the past where I've had to convince people, and I cannot remember, any one of those incidents where the person on the opposite side of my conversation didn't sort of give me this blank stare to say that, okay, I'm going to do this, but because I have no choice, because I couldn't care less, because I just want to get it done and move on. There is an overlap, and it's a small overlap between influencing and convincing. The key difference between those two, though, is really about when and how much time those two take. So influencing takes time, and influencing requires a very clear sense of purpose. Whereas convincing someone doesn't really take time, and it does require some amount of purpose, but often really requires a description more than anything else. So, for example, if I were to talk now, let's just say about how wonderful it is to have homegrown cacao beans in a plant that I had in my front yard for the past 2 years, and how it's been a labor of love to take those and to ferment them and sort of dry those beans, roast them, and get the smell of the berries in my front yard, and think about all of that. I don't need to convince you, perhaps at the end of the conversation, to get a cup of coffee. And that's a great example if you think of it. If I've given you enough reason, if I've influenced you enough to bring you to the point where you want that coffee yourself, it's far easier, it's far more impactful, because, and I hope you're thinking about that plant in my front yard, because I don't have one right now, but if we were to go for a coffee right now, I'd like to have that picture in your mind. But that's what influencing is about. Influencing is about telling a story, about finding common ground. It's about putting that seed. For me, one of the best ways of explaining influence is inception. Planting that seed, getting that idea in there. And you'll find that we're working with engineers on your team, you're working with designers on your team. It's great to come up and say, hey, here's a document that explains what I want. Thank you very much, goodbye. As opposed to having a sit down for 15 minutes and telling that person who the user is, why this is important to them, what happens when you get this right, how impactful that can be for them, and then perhaps saying, what do you think we should do? You might be surprised, you might actually find a better solution than what you described in the first place.
I totally agree with your response, and I just got a sudden taste of willing to try some fresh coffee. So it works, I guess. On the same time, I found myself in moments where I'm actively and purposely trying to convince someone with proper arguments, saying, hey, I have this idea, I have these arguments on top of my mind and all the research that I've probably have done separately. And you can probably also launch into a healthy debate. So probably in that moment, you are further away from influencing, but into a healthy way of convincing people that, look, I really believe this and I really want to try it out, and how can we work together to achieve this dream that I have. And I think this links back to one of the types of leadership that you've mentioned in the beginning.
Indeed, and that's very true. You'll be surprised though, I think even in a constructive debate, when you're talking about a topic, your influence will play a positive role there in how you see each other. If you're in a conversation, in a debate with someone where you have no influence, they may be very likely to, even at times, and I'll be honest, I've been in some of these conversations, even at times believe you when you put hard facts on the table. And so there is a small amount of influence at play there as well, but arguably perhaps not as much as when you were selling an idea without facts and so on and so forth. If you're in a debate with someone with hard facts, you should let that, of course, steer, but rely on a foundation of influence there to serve as the backbone for trust between the people you're speaking with and yourself.
I don't know. Mansoor, you're raising your hand. You want to add something?
Yes, well, I have a question, especially after these interesting ones. So especially when you discussed the fact that, yeah, some teams are actually, in a perspective of authority and who they report to, they might have different leadership figures, let's say. So, and I wanted to ask, like, would you think, or did you maybe experience any instances where actually having multiple leaders or too many leaders per se was overwhelming to a certain person or to the team? And would that be a case where sometimes doing the righteous and leadership kind of thing is to maybe tone it down or something?
I want to make sure I understand the question correctly. So someone's in a position where they have potentially different leadership lines of reporting, if you will. And what again are they trying to tone down?
Yeah, like if let's say like from the PM point of view, so the PM is acting as a leader, so as we discussed, but also like the members of the team, because they're reporting to other leadership figures, so they're head of engineering, of design, etc. They're feeling maybe a little bit overwhelmed or a little bit torn, not because of a necessarily a conflict or anything, but because too much leadership and too much to respond to, let's say. Would you think that that then the leaders should do something, or is it like a step that one of the leaders should see and maybe tone it down a bit, or do something about it? Like, what would be the approach?
I understand. Okay, so I mean, the key here is about, I guess, in a way, it's about allegiance. If you have a torn loyalty, you have two people sort of, I think in the worst case, driving you in two different directions. You have a line manager or a leader that you report to, and a PM that you work with who you don't really report to. If those two individuals are driving you in two different directions, I cannot imagine most people siding with the PM. It would be counterintuitive in a lot of ways, because in most of these situations, I found that people will align their allegiance or swear their allegiance to their fixed lines or their solid lines of reporting, which in this case might be the person who their direct leader is, rarely will you find that they'll align with the product manager. So this, in a way, tends to sort itself out. However, if you find that you're in a position or someone is in a position where you find that there are these two very different viewpoints, and that they're both equally, I guess, with merit, there is no solution here but to break that stalemate, to find common ground between those two. At the end of the day, I think that, you know, if this continues and those two directions, those two decisions tend to pull in opposite directions, that you'll eventually, or this individual may eventually side with their line manager, that solid reporting line. It just seems intuitive. But I think the key step here would be to try and break that stalemate by finding common ground. You should hopefully not be in this position. If you're a product manager and you see this, you should recognize that early on and try and find ways to ally. Again, remember the framework, ally with that leader of the person you're working with to make sure that you understand them and that they understand you. To empathize with them, understand why they're pulling in a different direction from you, and hopefully they'll understand as well why you're pulling in a different direction. And to then find those currencies, to be able to find ways to bridge that gap, to align yourselves to the benefit of the person you're working with.
So this points back to the Cohen-Bradford model.
Indeed.
Yeah, I actually took a note of this. I want to research this a little bit later. Anyone from the audience has any questions? I don't see on YouTube anything. Otherwise, I wanted to, maybe as a side note, Albert, so you've mentioned that the empathy has decreased in the university compared to 30 years ago. Do you think that the technology has a say in this?
I think it does, and it's undeniable. As individuals, as people, we're often today, you know, we don't quite have the same persona in person and the same persona online. 30 years ago, people couldn't quite have that same divide, so people were expressive in person. People used emojis on their real faces. People express themselves and they empathize with other individuals around them. We often find today that we have two personas for ourselves. We have the emotive, expressive, empathetic person on chat, where we share, you know, emotions and understand our friends better in platforms like WhatsApp and Slack and so on. And we find these sometimes amiss when we meet people in person. That at some level has a bearing on just how much empathy we have as a society, which is exactly what this piece of research seems to have found. That as people have found this different environment to empathize on, that they've diluted their actual sense of empathy for their individuals. And so, long story short, technology has played a role in this, and hopefully, if you recognize this, you can use technology to strengthen that empathy as opposed to diluting it.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think it's probably the let's say the quantity of empathy, if we can call it like this, it's probably the same, but it gets distributed for a wider audience, and that's why it gets diluted for the persons that you are interacted in your near proximity. Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we don't have any questions. I think we can thank you very much, Albert, for joining us in this session. And for myself, I'm sure I'm going to take this model of from Cohen and Bradford and see how I can twist it to get some benefit out of that. Thanks a lot again for joining us in this evening, and thank you, Mansoor, as well. Thanks everyone who joined us, and yeah, wish you all the best.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Mihai. Thank you, Mansoor.
Thanks, Albert. Thanks, everyone. And see you again soon.
Bye-bye.